Hello everyone and welcome into another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name, as always, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this Tuesday afternoon. We have a great show ahead. We'll be talking a lot more about the MLB Spring Training. It's finally upon us. We're getting the first glimpse of new phases and new places, impressive teams, and I'm going to update you on all the spring training questions that could be answered over the coming weeks. We'll be looking at the best odds for certain teams in terms of winning this year's World Series. And then we transition to the sport of college basketball. We talk about the AP poll, the top 5 teams in the land, and what their future in the short term could look like before we get into NCAA tournament time. Then we're going to preview a very interesting game, not necessarily the best game on tonight's slate in the NBA, but a game defined by a move that did not happen between these two teams. That's right, the Hornets and the Lakers we're going to preview tonight. And then last but not least, I'm going to go across the pond, preview tomorrow's games of the knockout playoffs second leg in the Champions League, because as of always, certain games are being played right now with high stakes in the Champions League. So unfortunately, I can't preview them, even though some of them might be better than tomorrow's slate of games. But still going to be a very interesting segment once we get to it. But before we get into any of these fun segments on tap for today, I want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the network and the shows around it if you haven't done so already, to keep up to date on all our new content. Consider availing yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, as well as our website gsmcpodcast.net as well, to better contribute and interact with the shows whilst we are live streaming. I love hearing your guys' opinion. I'm glad to have the comments coming in as we come along. I'll try and keep up to date with all of them as quickly as possible. But I always genuinely appreciate that part of the show when you, our faithful audience, contribute and interact with me as well to make this show that much better. But without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment of today's show, talking about spring training. Just started. Pitchers and catchers reported a couple of days ago, and certain batters a couple of days ago as well. But certainly a lot of interesting storylines as we head into preseason for certain teams in the MLB. And I feel like the narrative is around certain players, but I think that even more of the narrative surrounding spring training stem from new faces and new places, or whether or not certain players have signed extensions or not. And that's what makes this spring training so interesting. A lot of teams already have all of their business done headed into spring training, but a few others probably are not heading into spring training with as clear a picture of what their team is going to look like for not just the short term, but the long term future as well. And so that's what I want to address. And so without further ado, let's just jump right into the teams that I'm going to be monitoring in their spring training journey. Starting off with one of the must-see teams of this period. Not the Los Angeles Dodgers, although a lot of people are hyped about them as well, but the New York Mets. Because I truly believe, in my personal opinion, you have the Dodgers, but the Mets on paper, I feel like, have the chance to have the even better lineup in terms of raw talent. I feel that Juan Soto's addition to this team adds so much power at the top of the lineup that even though the bottom of the lineup kind of gets a little bit iffy, especially offensively, you have so much power in that core four of him, Lindor, Alonso, and a breakout candidate in Mark Vientos who can produce runs for you. So I'm really looking forward to how this team comes together on the field, how many runs they can potentially score, and most importantly, the bonds they create in spring training, because that segues into what could potentially be some off-field issues dependent on how Soto fits into the squad, not just on the field, but in the locker room. There were talks about how he fit into the Yankees culture, and they were not necessarily the most positive. So he still remains in New York with the Yankees' crosstown rivals, but how will he address the media? How will he come across to his teammates? Most importantly, will he immerse himself into the positive culture that the Mets have had instilled in them over the past couple of years? So I'm really intrigued to see not just how all that power comes together on the field, but off the field as well. And then, of course, we can talk about the Dodgers, but really I feel like the one big question about the Dodgers is not anything to do with the players they have already had within their team with all this experience between them. It's about one of the players they signed, Roki Sasaki. What are they going to do with him? Because we already talked about him not just as potentially one of the best pitchers in the rotation, but also as an amateur prospect, because that's certainly what that contract says he is. Because of his unique status as an international amateur, having not played, I believe, enough years in the Japanese league to qualify as someone who can immediately step onto a major league roster, chances are he starts out his major league career in the minor leagues. But what I want to see is how the Dodgers treat this issue, because certainly his stuff is good enough to overwhelm certain hitters in the MLB. It certainly is good enough for the Japanese Baseball League, which is considered right under the MLB in terms of quality players. So I feel like Roki Sasaki isn't that far away from being a competent starting pitcher for the Dodgers. But because of how loaded that pitching rotation already is, I feel like Roki Sasaki can be used in so many different ways. He can be called up at any different time. But most importantly, I just want to see how he handles it all. And if he's the real deal, and if the Dodgers really believe they have something in him for the long-term future. And while obviously there are way more storylines the Dodgers have attached to them as well, I feel like Roki Sasaki is the big one. But now enough of the NL. Because we kind of know who's going to contend in the NL, at least in my eyes. Let's transition to the AL, where I feel like it's so log-jammed at the top that I feel there really is no one separating themselves as the AL favorite. You obviously had the Yankees, who hopefully are betting on the fact that both Paul Goldschmidt and Cody Bellinger as two players make up for what Juan Soto was as one, and even more so defensively, because they were not a good defensive team, and that was glaringly clear in the World Series. But you do lose that power in the middle of your lineup with Judge and Soto. But as long as Judge keeps raking and the defense gets better because of these additions, then I feel like the Yankees profile as potential favorite. And also, fans finally got what they wanted. Their left-handed pitcher in Max Fried as well. And you can't get better than that at the position, especially a left-handed pitcher like him. Then we go to a team like the Orioles in the AL East as well. Much younger, a lot more depth at all the certain positions. You got Adley Rutschman, you got Gunnar Henderson, you got Heston Kjerstad, so much talent. Still an elite farm system as well, but the question will always be about them. They had Corbin Burnes last year. They lost him to the Diamondbacks this year. Who's your top pitcher? Charlie Morton? Kyle Bradish? You have to decide. And if they don't, then I feel like they're still going to be contenders in the AL East because of the power within their lineup. But in the postseason, pitching matters. And yes, Charlie Morton can be considered to be one of the best postseason pitchers of this era, but I don't really see this rotation translating well in a 7-game series. It's going to have to rely on the offensive production they get. Then you switch to teams that are on the come-up, the Tigers and the Royals. And the big question about them is, are they going to be kind of like the Moneyball A's of this era, where they kind of play the small ball game, get players who win games on the defensive side of the ball, and not necessarily win with power? Or are they going to start becoming big players in the next couple of free agency cycles to really build up these squads, which are, for the most part, thin offensively? Not saying that there aren't great players on either of these teams. For Detroit, you have Scoble, you add the pitching position, then you have guys like Torkelson and Green who are coming up, and then for the Royals, you have guys like Bobby Witt Jr., you have Vinny Pasquantino, and pitchers like Cole Reagans, Brady Singer, who are on the come up, but ultimately it's going to lie in how they play the game of baseball. Not just in the short term, but the long term. And then last but not least, I'm going to throw their hat in the ring. How about the Texas Rangers? Bochy is always like every 2 years kind of guy. This team was not healthy last year. A lot of players who they incorporated into their roster regressed the mean last year or were injured for large portions of the season. Now everyone's fully healthy, including Jacob deGrom, who finally probably gets a prolonged period as a starting pitcher for Texas. Guys like Josh Young, Evan Carter, who didn't play much last year, will get reincorporated. Wyatt Langford's going to be expected to grow. And I feel like the additions they made in the free agency cycle were necessarily high profile, and that's maybe because of the TV rights restrictions that are placed on them at the current moment, but there's still a lineup that can get going, and I feel like, as a Texas Rangers fan myself, I feel confident that because of the weakening AL West, now is Texas' chance to really establish a stronghold on that division. But who knows? Someone can emerge from the depths of the AL and surprise us all. We never really know about that particular league. As Death of Slim Shady says, hey bro, how are you? Sorry I'm not watching your stream lately. Just got back my account. Thank you for that. And it's a perfect way to segue into our break. But when we come back after the break, we're going to be talking with the teams with the best odds to win this year's World Series. See you on the other side.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you, as always, to avail yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, to better contribute and interact with the shows around the network as you wish. I love hearing all your guys' opinions on certain sports. I learn from you guys as well, and thank you very much for everything you do for the network, whether it's leave a comment or even a tip or donation if you feel so inclined. It's genuinely appreciated by all concerned around the network, not just me and my show, but others as well, doing great things in their own right, and it just makes them that much better. So thank you for all you do. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of today's show, talking about the teams with the top odds to win the 2025 to 2026 MLB World Series. And a lot of the teams that came up in the previous segment are going to be the favorites. And they're going to be monitored not just through spring training, but throughout the regular season, throughout the playoffs, and so on and so forth. But It's how all these teams handle that pressure that I think is going to be an even bigger storyline than people realize, because every single one of them here has the talent and the potential to make it all the way. But they're in large media markets, or some of them are in smaller ones, but just have this immense pressure to contend because of potential windows opening. So it's a very interesting MLB landscape, not just amongst these teams, potential contenders on the outside looking in terms of potentially winning. So without further ado, let's talk about the top teams and maybe some dark horses that could emerge potentially for my bettors out there. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, starting off with the betting favorite right now, the Los Angeles Dodgers at plus 300. And there's no reason as to why anyone should really question it. It's because they have the deepest roster in all of Major League Baseball. They signed Roki Sasaki to add to that already deadly pitching rotation. They signed Blake Snell as well, and people forget about that. They added so much depth, not just in the infield, but the outfield as well, with both Ha-Seong Kim and Michael Conforto. Oh yeah. And they re-signed Tommy Edman and retained Kike Hernandez, two postseason heroes last year. And oh yeah, Freddie Freeman's going to be healthier. Mookie Betts is still there. Clayton Kershaw could return to this rotation. Tyler Glasnow could return to this rotation more healthily. And most importantly, Shohei Ohtani's now going to be a two-way player after recovering from Tommy John surgery last year. It's ridiculous how talented this Dodgers team is, and it's quite unfair if you really think about it. But that's just the beauty of how teams can construct their roster. Kudos to GM Andrew Friedman doing this job by bringing together all these talented players, because it's truly remarkable to behold in how this team could potentially have a stranglehold on the MLB for the next 5 to 10 years, potentially, if all of these players stay healthy, extend their contracts, most importantly, potentially develop a sneakily, shockingly good farm system as well. So the Dodgers could be amongst the ranks to be betting favorites for the next couple of World Series, and not just for this one, as the defending champions. But my question about them is, they're in LA, and they're now going to be healthier than ever. And that media circus surrounding this team is going to grow. And injury concerns as a result could grow as well. So, if one or more players who are important to the success of this team potentially get injured, don't play well, there are going to be questions asked about it. It's how they rise above it, because there's not really been a repeat champion in the last 2 decades, not since the 98 to 2000 Yankees. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the week. I think that this Dodgers team is well equipped to be the first, but they have to answer a lot of questions both on the field and off it as well. Then let's talk about the New York Yankees, the second betting favorite here at plus 800. We talked about how they might have improved defensively, at the very least, by adding Paul Goldschmidt and Cody Bellinger, still elite defensive players. But you're losing a lot of power and pop in that lineup, and now you're relying on more secondary pieces in Jazz Chisholm, Anthony Volpe, and Austin Wells to hit for you. So I think that switch up in the lineup could spell more low-scoring games for this Yankees team. But I do think when you look at this roster on paper, it's very good now defensively. I think that you've covered up a lot of areas of need by signing both Goldschmidt and Bellinger. It balances out both the infield and outfield. And you also made fans happy in terms of finally bringing in a left-handed pitcher to balance out a very righty-heavy rotation. But it's all up to these quote-unquote role players. I wouldn't exactly call them role players because they're still important pieces in this lineup, but you get the picture because of who was there last year. So Jazz Chisholm, Anthony Volpe, Austin Wells. On the pitching side of things, Luis Gil needs to step up his game a lot as well to truly bolster that rotation. And I feel like this Yankees team, yes, they lost Soto, but I think that they made very smart additions. As Deathless Mercedes says, do you talk about sports other than MLB? We'll get to those in a little bit, my friend, but for now we're sticking in the MLB range and talking some Yankees baseball here. But I do appreciate that comment because, don't worry, we'll get to other sport yet, my friend. But talking about the New York Yankees, I feel like all the questions surrounding them are going to come from the media and it come from the post-Juan Soto era, just because of the polarizing player he was in the clubhouse. So I feel like, in a weird way, the Yankees might be better off without him, but they still have to prove it, and the younger players in this lineup have to prove it as well. Then let's talk about the team that now has Mr. Juan Soto, the New York Mets. And I feel like the New York Mets are not just going to be about Soto this year. They're going to be about the plan they believe they have in terms of making these high-profile signings, but also growing these younger players like a Mark Vientos, like a Francisco Alvarez, potentially maybe like a Brett Beatty if he can finally establish himself as a nice piece in this roster. But I do feel like the Mets' biggest questions are how they overcome the addition of Juan Soto. How Juan Soto transitions from the Yankees clubhouse to the Mets clubhouse, which has a more positive culture attached to it that developed last year. And if it gets disrupted, how the team performs. Because remember, this team got off to a terrible start at the beginning of last year, but then they grew into the season. And Juan Soto now entering that landscape could spell danger for their start yet again. But I'm willing to believe that the power in this Mets lineup can compensate for any external issues that potentially arise. And that's why I'm banking on them as potentially the best threat in the NL to make the World Series outside of the Dodgers at plus 850. But now let's talk about the depth of the NL East specifically, because it's not just the Mets. They're going to have a media circus surrounding them, a lot of questions surrounding them, a lot of stars in their lineup. The Atlanta Braves are there as well, and they may not even be the second best team in the NL East. In fact, I don't even know if there is a best team in the NL East. That's how even I believe the Mets, Braves, and Phillies are. The Braves are here because of the rejuvenation of bringing back a player like Ronald Acuna Jr., in my opinion. That adds depth to your outfield. They already have, perhaps in my opinion, one of the best offensive and defensive infields you potentially have. Both Austin Riley and Matt Olson aren't power guys, but they get the job done. This is one of the best hitting lineups in all of MLB because you have the power of a Ronald Acuna Jr., but you have guys that just are instinctual hitters at the plate like Olsen and Riley. And so that just makes them a tough team. And don't forget about the ascension of guys like Harris and guys like Arcia who bring that experience to this lineup. And then you look at the pitching rotation. Yeah, they lost Freese, but Strider's on the come up. They still have a ton of guys in that rotation who can get the job done. And Andre says, who's my MLB team, bro? Hopefully we'll get to them by the end of this segment because they're not on this odds list. But they could potentially be a dark horse this year, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But the Atlanta Braves certainly are another NL East team outside of the Mets and potentially even the Phillies to potentially challenge the Dodgers in the NL hierarchy. Then the last but not least, these guys, the Orioles, I feel like are the first quote-unquote dark horse, even though a lot of people have been hyping them up over the past couple of years. And who wouldn't? This is an incredible MLB team built through their farm system and their youth. These youthful players finally getting out onto the field and making themselves known. I love Adley Rutschman. I love Gunnar Henderson. I love Heston Kjerstad. At 1777, Memorabilia, Larry Sports says, who you got winning the AL? Potentially maybe the Orioles, but right now, if you were to put me on the spot, I would have to say the Yankees just because I feel like defense to them was a little bit more important than trying to retain Juan Soto, even though it's going to lead to a couple more disappointing games. But I do like the addition. Every year people say Orioles, they choke in the playoffs. I get that, which is why And what brings me to the dark horses in the AL, and what brings me to my favorite team, my man Andre, the Texas Rangers. I feel like the Yankees are in a division in the AL East that could be very tough to determine. The AL Central, you got some weird teams in there. The Guardians, the Tigers, the Royals. All these teams that could potentially be, elite MLB teams, but not necessarily appealing MLB teams. Then you look to the AL West. That's where madness can ensue. That's where the Houston Astros look weaker than they have in years past. They lose Alex Bregman, they lose Ryan Presley, and now the Texas Rangers and potentially even the Seattle Mariners could emerge here. If Texas remains healthy, if Jacob deGrom gets a prolonged period of time pitching in this team, and Josh Young, Evan Carter, Adolis Garcia, Wyatt Langford all have bounce back years, this Texas team could potentially be a dark horse candidate. And Bochy's one of those guys who's like every other year can make magic happen. So who knows? These are right now the betting favorites. I don't necessarily agree myself, but we know what you continue to think about the betting favorites to win the World Series this year. But coming up next, we transition to the world of college basketball, analyzing the top 5 in that particular poll after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our third segment, we just got a comment from 1777 Memorabilia. I think Rangers will need to add an arm approaching the trade deadline, and they could be right there with the Yankees. I agree with you. I feel that they have certain pitchers in this staff that can get the job done. They re-signed Nathan Eovaldi, and, they have middle of the rotation guys that they can rely upon. Maybe Andrew Heaney and John Gray step up. But I do think that if health is a big question in this pitching rotation, they could look to add an arm once the trade deadline goes around and they feel they're in a good spot where they're contending in the AL West and potentially for a top seed in the AL side of the bracket. So that's a fantastic point because I don't necessarily think the Rangers are that far away. But now we transition into the world of college basketball. Crazy weekend that ensued this past one in men's college basketball that led to a little bit of a shakeup in the AP polls, and I wanted to bring that to your attention. Always fun talking men's college basketball, especially during this time of year, and especially these teams, because these teams are going to be the focal point of, discussions surrounding who could be the teams to beat in March Madness. So without further ado, let's talk about the latest AP poll in terms of the top 5. Coming in at number 5, Tennessee. And this number 5 position could go to a number of different teams. Potentially, if you're a big fan of Houston, as 1777 said, great topics. Thank you, my friend. I love talking about both of these sports. They're near and dear to my heart. But men's college basketball, especially at this time of year, gets really exciting. But getting into the Tennessee Volunteers, always a team, in my opinion, that's going to contend, right? And like I said, this number 5 spot could be up for debate because Houston is playing so well, but just the power of the SEC this year, man. You can't deny the fact that SEC teams look damn impressive. And Tennessee, one of the best defensive teams in the country. Over the past couple of weeks, they have one of the worst losses in the country to Kentucky, but that just goes to show how big the SEC is this year. As 1777 says, lots of love for the SEC this year, but in the tournament they tend to choke. I want to wait and see, but I do agree with that statement. But for now, it's the cream of the crop. And Tennessee, could be one of those teams that people get iffy about in the tournament, but right now they're playing elite defensively, have one of the best wins in the country against Florida, holding them at 44 points. But they did lose to Kentucky, so you can see the Jekyll and Hyde mentality to them. But I believe that if Chaz Lanier gets going, he'll be the next Dalton Knecht. And Zakai Ziegler is one of the best point generals in the land. Kind of reminds me of, if you remember, UCLA's Tyler Campbell and how he handles the position. I really like him on both ends of the floor. Very rarely do we see a point guard play both ways so passionately. So I like the complexion of this Tennessee team, but their days could be numbered in terms of the top 5, just because Houston is just gone about their business so beautifully, but because of the fact they're in the Big 12, maybe a bit more understated than the performances of Tennessee in the past couple of weeks. But nonetheless impressive to any Houston Cougars fans out there, and we could potentially see them in a couple weeks' time. Then let's go into the confusion here, kind of where everything gets muddled up. Both Duke and Florida were tied for 3rd in the latest AP polls, but I think that Florida might have overtaken Duke, but let's talk about Duke right now, because Duke is taking care of business down the stretch of the season against the opponents they should beat. They've beaten Stanford, Cal, and Virginia in dominant fashion. Cooper Flagg's playing the best basketball of not just any freshman in the country, but any player in the country. Kamon Malwalk's rounding into his own. Tyrese Proctor holding it down at the point guard position. Con Kneppel kind of still a little bit more Jekyll and Hyde than I like him to be, but I think he's going to grow into the season. He's had impressive performances thus far, but ultimately, I think that this team's going to be asked a lot of questions come March Madness time, and these freshmen especially are going to have to answer them. So I feel that this Duke team, the sky's the limits for them, but they're going to need to continue to prove that they can take steps forward to where the freshmen might not have to be the problem in the tournament, if you know what I mean. I feel like this Duke Blue Devils team could go further than even the Zion Williamson, RJ Barrett teams of old, but it's going to have to come down to all these players peaking at the right time. And I still believe that Duke, at the very least, could spell Final Four potential, but I'm going to have to start asking more questions of guys like Kneppel, guys like Malwalk. And now that Malik Brown is injured, that could be a little bit dangerous in terms of how this team defensively projects over the next couple of weeks in their conference tournament. Could be trouble for Duke. Also, they don't rebound well on offense, says 1777 memorabilia. I've seen that in the couple of games that I have seen of Duke, and that concerns me. They're not necessarily the biggest squad on paper, and they do certainly rely more on defense than, shockingly, offense at this point in time. But I choose to believe that this Duke team is going to grow into the season. At least I hope, because we all know the traits that guys like Kneppel and Malwalk hold and how they can develop. So I'm holding out hope that Cooper Flagg is not going to have to be the superstar come March Madness, but it remains to be seen whether or not I can truly trust the depth pieces in this Duke roster. Whereas for Florida, I love how everything is coming together for this team. I love that they have one of the best front courts in the entire country with Tommy Haw, Alex Kahn, and Micah Hanlockton. Don't forget about him, injured all of last year, finally getting an opportunity to play big minutes for this Florida team, and most underrated point guards in the country in Walter Clayton Jr. I love this Florida Gators roster. Just consistently, ever since that loss to Tennessee, just putting up astounding performance after astounding performance, and I feel like this team can't go understated in the SEC. This might be the team that a lot of people hinge their hopes on and either overexceeds expectations or underperforms in the tournament, in my opinion. And here's the reason why. Last year, I feel like Florida's problem was they could outscore anybody. But, as Andre says, Thomas Haw is him, and I completely agree. And 1777 memorabilia said Florida might be the best team in the country. But here's where I have certain misgivings about them, let's say. Last year, I think Florida's problem was that even though, as Andre continues to say, I'm so hyped for March Madness, I love talking about it too, but here's my thing about Florida. I feel like Florida's problem last year was that they could outscore anybody. They consistently got scored on. This year, I kind of potentially see the opposite happening. As much as I love this front court, as much as I love Walter Clayton Jr. as a perimeter threat, maybe this team will become too reliant on certain players putting the ball in the basket and not necessarily focus in on playing a well-rounded offensive game. And I feel that in March Madness, there are going to be a lot of teams that want to test you in transition, speed up the game. If you say you're a team like Florida expecting to be a number one seed and you're going up against a smaller team. As Andre says, I don't trust that backcourt when it gets gritty. So I say that this team needs to focus more on how clutch they can be. Because if they are clutch in the tournament, then I do believe that they can win this thing. And I feel that they have the players and talent, but it all just needs to come together in that tournament-style format. And I just don't know if I can trust them enough. But because of how flawed it's starting to get at the top of the rankings, no one team really separating themselves from others, I think that they have a legitimate shot at winning the tournament. Let's get into those top two teams who actually played this weekend. Number 2, Alabama, fortunately took the L. Just, in my opinion, I saw a little bit of this game just chucking up too many threes. There wasn't the game for them to really try and beat Auburn by the 3. I think that Nate Oates had to diversify the game plan a little bit more. I know this team lives and dies by the 3, and when they get hot from deep, they are one of the hottest teams in the country, especially in terms of how they rate offensively. But it was not the game, especially at home against that Auburn team. And that's why even when Johnny Broome went down, I just think that this Alabama team can sometimes become too one-dimensional. And I really thought that this year they would take actually a step forward defensively as well because of Grant Nelson's play in last year's tournament. But I'm starting to see the same problems where they kind of get overwhelmed in the interior. And I feel like that will come back to bite them because this is starting to become kind of like the Florida situation like I described when last year they could outscore anybody, they could get scored on by anybody. And Alabama could potentially be that team. But I just feel that they have the quality. Chris Youngblood's proven he can be a competent player off the bench. Sears is still, in my opinion, potentially the best point guard in all of college basketball. But I feel like they're just going to have to rely too much on their scoring, and that's going to come back to bite them. And it did against Auburn. And this team, man, even without Johnny Broome, potentially going to be the Wooden Award winner. Potentially, because Flagg carries his team, as we mentioned before. But Johnny Broome, even in his absence, this team is just incredible. So much depth, both in the front court and the back court. When Johnny Broome goes down, Chaney Johnson steps in. Dahad Pettiford, the impressive freshman, whom I'm very familiar with as someone who was in that Catholic school basketball when he was at Hudson Catholic Circle and kind of knew about him a little bit. Guys like Chad Baker-Mazzara, Denver Jones, Miles Kelly being really impressive over the past couple of weeks. Just so much depth in this roster. And overwhelmed Alabama. Alabama tried to play their game. Auburn says, well, we'll just play it better because we don't just shoot threes. We can win with perimeter shooting, but also in the interior as well. And they're the most well-rounded team. As Andre says, I don't know if anyone can really beat them once they get into the tournament format because of how dominant they are. But that is the top 5 as of right now. Let me continue to know what your thoughts are. As 1770 memorabilia mentions Florida, I would love to see that game. I would love to see that game in a neutral site, two of the best front courts in the nation, going at it, and I think that it could be a potentially very special final game of the season. But who knows? That will just about conclude it, though, for this segment. Coming up next, though, we are going to be transitioning to a game in the NBA that will be defined not for the teams playing in it, but for a trade. You'll see what it is after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast as we come back to a comment from 1777 Memorabilia talking about the Big East as an underrated conference. I'm on the fence about that one a little bit. I feel like more of the Big East depths will be known or come to be known come conference tournament time, where potentially I see this conference having a bid stealer, say, in one of the bubble teams in Xavier and Villanova, or maybe even a Georgetown if Thomas Sorber gets hot. But I do like St. John's and Marquette enough to where I can see them make, at the very least, Elite 8 runs. But I feel like, it all depends as well on coaching, right? And I feel like Big East has underrated coaches. The SEC has elite coaches, but I feel like tournament-style basketball is a completely different thing. And Bruce Pearl has an impressive record at Auburn, and Nate Oates as well in certain games. But it all is going to come down to how they play in the tournament. And potentially their styles of play might come back to bite them. But heading into an NBA game that I don't necessarily think a lot of people are going to watch or even know about tonight, but I just want to talk about because of the trade that wasn't. Yes, I'm talking about the Hornets and the Lakers and that rescinded Mark Williams trade that really is leaving a seed of doubt in my mind about what both teams were thinking. And yes, it has become clear that there are clearly issues with Mark Williams on the injury front, and serious ones at that. We talked about this at GSMC in terms of how a big man like Mark Williams will profile over the next couple of years with these serious and significant injuries. But the reason why I want to talk about this game at length is because it's not necessarily going to be a Mark Williams game, but it's going to be a game where Alex Len is going to get called into question more than any other player tonight and potentially for the rest of the season. And it's quite ironic that it comes against a team that the Lakers were willing to do business with for a very talented young center who now has injury problems. There are so many storylines, not just amongst these two teams, but potentially the Mavs as well, and the irony of Anthony Davis's injury. But these two teams really are truly bizarre when placed side by side. Now let's talk about them. And I know that a lot of you probably won't be tuning in, and I don't necessarily have to tell you about the different directions these teams are headed on. The Lakers 8-2 in their last 10, the Hornets 1-9 in their last 10. The Hornets sit second bottom in the East. The Lakers are rising in the fifth. As Andre says, I still can't believe the Mavs did that, and I can't believe it either. But here's where we stand. We're talking about a potentially insignificant game in the picture for both conferences, but it's just defined by two trades that people couldn't believe happened for the first, and then a trade that should have happened and could have potentially cemented the Lakers as the championship favorite, as 1777 Memorabilia said NBA made an executive decision with Luka. I feel like it's just bizarre to talk about. But yeah, I can't even preview this game without mentioning, that trade either. because that trade kind of precipitated the fallout of the Mark Williams trade. Because without that trade, the Lakers probably aren't reaching for Mark Williams and willing to give up someone like Dalton Knecht. And then that trade never gets rescinded because Charlotte doesn't necessarily have or is having reservations about, as Andre says, just why for a 32-year-old that's made out of glass. I get you. But it's just truly bizarre, as Andre also says AD's on his way out real soon. I just feel like, yes, the Lakers offloading Anthony Davis relieves some of that pressure. But it's the Hornets trade that really, as 1777 memorabilia says, Nuggets were the winners when Mark Williams didn't join LA, and there could be truth in that because the Nuggets are also gaining momentum in the West. But it clearly creates a murky picture, right, in terms of how the NBA and certain teams become big news and are allowed to have these trades happen where secrecy is paramount. And for the Luka trade, it was all about secrecy. But for the Mark Williams trade, it was all about concerns and reservations from both teams, it sounds like. As Andre says, Jackson Hayes is going to be guarding Joker. Well, I don't necessarily know if Jackson Hayes will be playing more than Alex Len, but that is a good point. And looking at this game, we're going to see if Alex Len is the answer. I don't know if he's going to get as many extended minutes as Jackson Hayes, but who knows. But here's why this game is so bizarre, in my opinion. Because the actual winners, and while I agree with 1777 memorabilia here, with the Nuggets being one of them, I actually think the Hornets might have preserved a little bit more of their future than people think. Because Mark Williams is someone who's a little bit too injury prone for some people's liking. But I still think that preserving a 25-year-old guy who, when he's on the court, really is highly talented at the position, dominant in both ways, on the defensive and offensive side of the floor. I feel like the Hornets, who really have no hope right now, despite the fact that LaMelo Ball is playing his behind off, I feel like you need to retain as much talent as you can. And chances are the Charlotte team is going to be bad for a large portion of the next decade or so. So at least keeping Mark Williams made a little bit of sense. The Lakers, in my opinion, could have been a little bit more desperate in pursuit of him, because I don't really think they would have stopped anyone with, Jackson Hayes. Now that Alex Len is in the rotation, maybe they have a better chance, because he's a body to throw out there to get a couple points, potentially protect the rim on the other end, and get the job done for you. But if I were the Lakers and I made a move like I did to acquire Luka, and I want to win now, I want to be the top contender in a very loaded NBA, I would have been pleading for the Hornets to allow this trade to happen no matter the circumstances. Because look what happened in LA with AD. AD got injured a myriad number of times with the Lakers. But it just goes to show that if you're willing to put up with it, you can still compete. And yeah, they won that bubble championship that not everyone is counting as a real championship. But I feel like that combination of him and LeBron worked out. And I feel like this Lakers team, and not just LeBron, needs a competent center. And that's what I feel like Mark Williams certainly was. And I'm not saying that Alex Len won't be, or indicting him from the start, because he has a chance to work his way into this lineup. The Lakers are already coalescing than they have without him and integrating Luka into the squad. But I feel like Mark Williams was a guy who you should have taken a chance on, because it's the exact same chance a lot of teams throughout his career taken on AD. And yeah, the Mavs are paying the price for it right now, but AD was still a very talented player when he was healthy, and potentially, once he comes back, could be a very integral piece for the short-term future for the Mavs. And so, if I'm the Lakers, and here's the thing that really shocks me about this whole situation, the Lakers actually have so much to offer certain teams. And it certainly feels like settling for Len was not the right choice when we're going to look back on this in hindsight. Even if they win, say, the next 5 NBA championships, and I know I'm over-exaggerating, but let's talk about hypotheticals here. If they win the next 5 championships, I still, in hindsight, will look back at this and say, well, Mark Williams, yes, maybe it's destiny, maybe it's fate that trade didn't go through, and look where the Lakers are now. But the profile of a guy like Williams at the age of 25 and playing the way he was, sans injuries, on both ends of the floor, could have spoke volumes for this Lakers team. And who knows what it would have turned out like had that trade gone through. Who knows if Mark Williams was the guy. But now we're left with the question of, how does Alex Len fit? Is he going to be good enough defensively, potentially offensively, to help this Lakers team? Because right now, I feel like while the Lakers are in a fantastic spot financially, picks-wise, capital-wise, I feel like taking a chance on Mark Williams could come back to bite them. And on the Hornets side of things, it's just a trying time for you. Yes, you have the talent of LaMelo Ball. Yes, Brandon Miller could potentially become a vital piece of your rebuild. But Mark Williams is such a big question mark for you that while I do think I'm going to be semi-right in that the Hornets will preserve their future by retaining Mark Williams, I think that this team realistically doesn't necessarily have much hope of building anyways. So I feel like the Hornets would have been okay either way, because they would have been getting Dalton connected, and at least, they wouldn't be losing too much in this trade. But it's the chance the Lakers didn't take that I feel could come back to bite them. Although in this game, their talent's going to be overwhelmingly clear. But I do want to see Alex Len in this offense and defense, and I want to see if this really could affect the Lakers, not in this game, not in the short term, but the long term as well. But that's all I have to say about that, because coming up next we transition for our final segment across the pond, talking about tomorrow's slate of Champions League knockout playoff second leg ties. A lot of exciting games amongst them. Real Madrid, Man City. Can Man City make the comeback? Tune in and find out after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back in to the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment, we're going to be talking about the Champions League. As Andre says, I have a feeling that City are going to spoil the party, and potentially I could too. But we have a lot of games to talk about. Tuesday's slate of games still not over. The surprise here, most likely to a lot of you guys here in America at the very least, will probably be Club Brugge beating my dark horse Atalanta so heavily on aggregate right now, currently leading 3-0 at the break, 5-1 at aggregate. Feyenoord surprising AC Milan perhaps, but I think that was perhaps the most likely of upsets, but clearly I did not see Club Brugge coming. Right now, Bayern and Celtic tie 0-0 at the half. Bayern still up on aggregate there. Benfica, Monaco tied 1-1 at the half, but Benfica 2-1 up on aggregate. But now let's get into tomorrow's slate of games. Still very exciting storylines. I want to talk about some important players in each of these ties, even if, they're still not in the balance or already gone and done with. Let's start with Dortmund Sporting because that one clearly falls in the latter camp. But I want to highlight a very astonishing player for Dortmund. And Dortmund find themselves in a similar situation, exceeding expectations in the Champions League, underwhelming domestically in the Bundesliga. Switched through a lot of managers, now under Niko Kovac, the former Bayern man. As Andre said, I can't believe AC Milan lost. I feel like, AC Milan is a very weak team if you look at it, outside of guys like Theo Hernandez and Rafael Leao and Christian Pulisic. They don't really have that talent of a midfield, and that defense is kind of compensating for something, I feel like. They have talented players, but they don't really have an identity, if you know what I mean. And I feel like, as Andre said, Jimenez's old club beat him. I can't with him. Oh, man. I feel like, AC Milan is one of those teams that just are there. You know what I mean? I don't really think that they are going to contend in the Serie A or, the Champions League for quite some time if they don't really build around the talented players they already have. But that's for today. Let's talk about an impressive player, even though this Dortmund Sporting tie most likely is over and done with, although I would have liked to have seen this tie with Victor Gyökeres still at Sporting. Let's talk about, though, the striker on the other side, the very impressive Serhou Guirassy. I love this guy as a Bundesliga fan, even though he plays for a lot of rival teams in his career. Last year, astonishing season at VfB Stuttgart, earning him this move to Borussia Dortmund, leading the Champions League in scoring. 10 goals in 9 games thus far. Really impressive. His chemistry with Brandt, his chemistry with Adeyemi, really impressive in that front three, at the very least in the Champions League. The less we say about them domestically, the better. But for now, all they really want to focus on, Dortmund, is the Champions League. And why not? Germany right now, not necessarily the most appealing country in terms of their teams succeeding domestically, as a lot of them are struggling right now. I mean, internationally in this competition they're struggling. But I do feel like with Bayern making the semifinal last year, Dortmund the final this year, Germany really can pounce on this opportunity. And Dortmund's taking it by the hand right now. And I'm really excited to see if Serhou Guirassy can continue his success in this competition tomorrow, even with this tie done and dusted. Now let's get into the closest tie outside of the big one tomorrow. PSV Juventus, another chance for an upset here, because I like the outlook of this PSV team. Off topic, but how did you see how bad Leverkusen showed this past weekend? Like 10 plus chances missed, as Andre. I unfortunately did not get a chance to watch the game, but I'm happy with a point as a Bayern fan myself, because Leverkusen in that matchup were gonna always be the aggressor. Bayern were not necessarily gonna throw that many players forward, but I'm just shocked that Kompany was bold in being as defensive as he was, seeing as to how Bayern's defense has weakened as of late. So I really think that we kind of got lucky there. But Leverkusen, man, what an interesting team these past couple of weeks. First of all, not necessarily starting your best players a week ago against Wolfsburg, and I know we're going off topic, but we'll get back. I just want to address Andre's question as a Bayern fan. But Bayer Leverkusen last week did not bring on their best players against Wolfsburg until very late in the game. And this game against Bayern, kind of the same thing, right? They are overwhelming them, but they just never got a hold on the game. And in that moment, when you start to feel like you can win this game, but Bayern have in the back of their mind, we will still be 8 points up if we draw, that had to weigh on them very heavily. So they just don't look like themselves this year, Leverkusen. And that's why they're quickly falling behind in the Champions League race. But getting back into this PSV-Juventus tie, I feel like the most important player in this tie is a former Europa League great in Luuk de Jong. And I know a lot of Sevilla fans out there love what this guy has done for them in the Europa League, but a lot of PSV fans are still waiting for him to get going in the Champions League. He's one of those strikers who goes understated. As Andre says, it's going to get scary when Xabi joins Madrid. I don't want to talk about that possibility just because Xabi should have been with Bayern, but I'm fine with company right now as long as we win something this year. But I digress. Getting back to a guy like Luuk de Jong here. He's one of those understated target man strikers who has this journeyman career, ends up at PSV in his home country, and only has 2 goals in 9 games. And I understand this PSV team is talented, especially in that midfield. Ivan Perisic is still doing great things at his age with them as well. But I'm looking for more out of Luuk de Jong as their true target man to get going and potentially swing this tie. Because Juventus, I feel like, are built for tournament-style football, and they're playing like it right now. They're playing smash-and-grab football under Thiago Motta in the Champions League, and I feel like they potentially could be another dark horse. So, if PSV can't get going, then I think that this tie will be done and dusted by halftime, because Luuk de Jong right now, to me, most likely is not going to change his tune immediately in this game. Then let's get into the all-Ligue 1 affair, PSG against the surprise team, Brest. And I know that, this tie clearly was going to lean PSG's favor, but kudos to this Brest team. And we can make jokes about the team name as much as possible, but I digress. I just feel like this team underrated throughout their Champions League tenure this season, their first season. They overachieved. Yes, they potentially got away with an easier schedule in the league phases, but they did their job, and they just went up against a team that dominates them regularly in Ligue 1, and they cannot escape that. But how impressive. Let's talk about PSG for a minute. How impressive has Ousmane Dembele looked at the turn of this year? 6 goals in the Champions League, 2 last week, to clearly give them a stranglehold on this tie, but clearly looking like one of the best players thus far in 2025. And if Ousmane Dembele gets going, this PSG team can be ticking like a clock. They're another team that can completely become a dark horse in this competition, completely alter our perception of what certain paths can look like for certain teams. So the fact that Ousmane Dembele is playing so well should lead to other teams being feared of PSG. I would be afraid of PSG right now if I were certain teams because of Ousmane Dembele's prowess, and they already have a very deep wing depth. They have guys like Bradley Barcola, Lee Kang-in. They signed Kavicha for cheap. I mean, this wing depth is just getting crazy talent. It might be some of the best wing depth in the Champions League this year. But, man, I cannot wait to see what this PSG team does in the round of 16. But then let's get to the grand finale here. Andre alluded to it. Real Madrid, Man City at the Santiago Bernabeu. Man City 3-2 down. This game could have gone either way. Erling Haaland finally stepping up in a big game, but Jude Bellingham at the death, winning the first leg for Real Madrid, taking them to the Bernabeu in the lead. But the reason why Andre's idea at the start of this segment wasn't so far-fetched is because of Omar Marmoush. And this is incredible to behold here, talking about someone that City fans did not even know at the start of the season. Maybe even some Bundesliga fans like myself were not familiar with at the start of the season. Impressed at the start of the season with Eintracht. Makes the big transfer to Man City. Has a hat trick over the weekend against Newcastle. And suddenly gives them hope that they can produce enough on the wings to really help them in attack. They're still banged up defensively. Akanji's going to miss this game. And then in terms of Real Madrid's defense, they're welcoming back a lot of their depth. Rudiger is coming back. Vasquez coming back as well. But you got to look at the two best players in this team to separate it. Erling Haaland certainly stepping up last week in terms of giving his team 2 goals when they needed it. But then the guy you always have to look out for, the wild card of this Real Madrid team, Jude Bellingham, can produce from anywhere, can produce at any time, really becoming one of the stoppage time heroes of this Real Madrid team. And I think that you always have to be aware of that danger. But I do think that City has more of a chance than people expect just because of all these teams improving. So I really think that this is the tie a lot of people are going to tune into tomorrow, and it's justified. But I don't really know what kind of game we're going to get because it always gets crazy in the second leg of Real Madrid Man City ties. But let me know what you think in the comments below, because that will just about do it for today's show. I've been Chris Shepard. This is the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. We'll see you all tomorrow, same time as always, 2:55 Eastern Standard Time for another great edition of the show. But I'm out for today.